afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to VOA Africa. I go by the name of Mike Hove, and I am joined in studio by young members of the African Union. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm joined by Cynthia Chigwenya to my right here, and of course, to my further right, Christian Leke. Welcome, ladies and gentlemen. Cynthia, we'll start off with you. How are you doing?
I'm doing all right. How are you doing, Mike?
I'm great. Thank you so much for joining us here.
Thank you for having us.
Let's delve into it. We have you here in Washington, D.C. Tell me more about your trip and what's going on. I know you're part of the U.S.-Africa Leaders Summit, so talk to me a little more about that.
Great. Thank you very much for having us. And I am one of the 5 young leaders that were appointed by the African Union to represent each of the 5 regions, and I represent Southern Africa, which makes up about 14 countries. And out of that region, I represent Young Peace Builders Network, so basically being the intermediator between the African Union as an institution and young people that are working at the grassroots level. And we've been participating in several events that took place ahead of the US-Africa Leaders Summit, and I think one of the engagements that we're looking at, how do we leverage these relations or policies to ensure that moving forward either in 2023 and beyond, young people are more engaged in governance and politics and also in peace building on the continent.
Now, Christian, you're from West Africa.
Yes. Central Africa.
Central Africa, yes. My apologies. Talk to me a little more about that. How is this whole summit contributing towards the region?
Well, actually, coming from a region which is currently plagued by violent conflict, I think that my mandate here is even much more critical because in the case of my country, Cameroon, we have different forms of conflict. If you look to Chad, you have Boko Haram. So it's a region which is very plagued by conflict. And it was quite very interesting that within the strategy, there's a conversation around peace and security. So my presence here, it's actually reflecting on what young people are thinking on how this new relationship, which is renewed between US and Africa, should be able to take into consideration young people's perspective. You'll bear with me that in times of war, young people suffer the most. You'll bear with me that there's a whole stereotype seeing young people all the times as troublemakers. But this is different when you're on the ground. We have many more young people who are working to build peace, and there's a need for them to be provided support and, of course, protection. I mean, these are some of the conversations that, as a representative from the African Union, I am putting before different stakeholders so that it is taken into consideration, because we have a very young continent and a continent which has over 75% of young people. So there's a huge chance for us to build on this conversation. Yeah.
I like the fact that you brought up young people here. How important is it to have young people participate in such discussions? Because if we look at our leadership across the continent, typically it's not youth reflective, but to now have young people be part of such a summit, how important is that?
I think it's very important, because most of the decisions that were to be made will be decisions that will benefit young people or my young people. So having them to be part of this conversation only goes a long way to show that the US and the African Union and countries in Africa are recognizing the important role that young people are playing to bring their perspective on the board. It is said in the African Union, we say it a lot amongst young people, something for young people without young people is against young people. Right. So these policies are going to be for young people. Our continent is pretty young, like I said. So having us on the table means they are recognizing that young people are experts, means that they are recognizing that young people are not leaders of tomorrow, but they are already leading, means that they are recognizing that it's important that the reflections should capture young people's perspective. And of course, when it comes to implementation, who are those who are going to implement? It's not the leaders who are maybe aging, but it's going to be young people themselves. And if we look at the situation within the continent in terms of peace and security, we look at climate change, you look at migration and many others. I mean, young people are the ones suffering. So articulating young people's perspectives in this conversation, it's one of the best things that has been done so far, and we are not relenting. We are ensuring that the conversation would not just end here, but we ensure that we also hold our governments accountable in terms of what they have promised to do for young people within the continent. So, I mean, these are how we are looking at these issues, and the 5 ambassadors have been doing a pretty good job in terms of advocacy around this.
Cynthia, let me turn to you here on this one. As a young female, throughout this entire summit, we're on day 2 now, and a lot of discussion has been there around how the U.S. is looking to invest into Africa, how the U.S. is looking to partner with Africa. How do you think such discussions are benefiting, especially young women in Africa?
Great. I think there three ways in which the deliberations and discussions we're having here at the US-Africa Summit can benefit young people, and particularly young women and other marginalized groups. The first being incentivizing policies that are inclusive on the African continent. And I think this is one of the initiatives that the US government can champion, which is incentivizing more and more African governments to be inclusive of not only women but young people as well as those from minority or indigenous groups. And in addition to that, I think there is also a need to invest in education, Africa's education system, which serves to be an equalizer for those that are either marginalized or those that do not have certain opportunities. And I believe this also brings about bridging a gap of inequalities, which was exacerbated by the COVID-19 pandemic. And then finally, I think the discussions around youth inclusion, and also the inclusion of young women, provides hope for many youth and also for many young girls on the continent. I think as they follow the deliberations and discussions at the summit, they're able to see themselves represented in the discussions that are happening, and they're given hope to say that I think with the right impetus and the right incentives, there could be more and more inclusion of young women in politics and governance.
Now, throughout this whole summit, as I mentioned, we're on day 2 now. One message that keeps being re-emphasized by both the US government and African leaders is that Africa is not here to seek aid, Africa is here for partnership. What does that message mean for you?
I think it's a message that has been said, or also reflective of engagements that were at the EU-AU summit earlier in the year. It's a message that's also we see being developed within the United Nations Security Council, that gone are the days where there would be a top-down approach where countries that are either what is deemed to be the developed continent get to detect or determine how governance is done on the African continent, but to encourage more partnership and to encourage more sort of a multidisciplinary approach where African stakeholders also have a say in terms of determining what projects are implemented on the continent, how they're implemented, how they're evaluated or monitored or reviewed. So I think it's a great way to start off, and it also encourages more ownership of projects beyond just monetary assistance and monetary finance. Yes.
Now, Christian, to come over to you, whilst on the same discussion, of course, of these promises, year in, year out, we find our leaders coming out to the diaspora. We find our leaders attending summits and all that, signing deals. However, the biggest discussion, especially amongst the youth, is how to make sure that these deals are followed through. Whatever is agreed on upon here in the United States, as the youth, what do you think should be done to make sure that there is a follow through, that everything promised is implemented?
Well, I think that one of, like you rightly mentioned, the challenge has always been good policies implementation, and it has become a culture. And that's why a couple of days ago when I was speaking during the human rights reflection, I talked about the importance of the American government as well to work towards ensuring accountability. We need to develop a system of leadership within the continent where there's cause and effect. You know, if you don't do what you promise, there should be an effect. And also, young people need to be sensitized more about how they can be able to engage to hold their governments accountable, and for them to think differently away from violence as a way to respond to some of these issues. There are non-violent perspectives. There are different ways in which you can vote a leader out if the leader fails. So I think that we need to also, as young people within the continent, to understand even much more that we have a role to play by voting our leaders. We should not be bought. We should not be used. I mean, these are the core things, because at the end of the day, when these policies are made, implementations are for the leaders. But there's this additional perspective which I would like to bring to you, which is also very important. Young people playing their part in implementing these policies. Yes, it's been set by governments and everything. But I think if we start taking the bull by the horn, and I think that's why the conversation of partnership, it's coming to strengthen that. The opportunity for young people in the continent to be able to also tap into the diaspora, and that's why there's a whole big conversation around people of African descent, diaspora, to see how we could be able to also create jobs, not waiting for governments to do these things. We should be able to respond to issues of peace and security, human rights, gender, climate, and all of that as young people and as citizens of the country. And if we are able to do that, You know, the conversation, which is very famous in the US, don't ask what the country has done,
Right.
you know, ask what you've done. I mean, this is where we have to move to, you know, in terms of this conversation. And a couple of days, we had a panel with a UN rep from the US who was talking about equity, and she was saying that the beauty about this process is also for US and Africa to share their experiences. Right. I mean, the US has that saying, ask what you've done for your country, not what your country has done for you. I mean, this is a culture that we need to imbibe. So I think this new fire of US-Africa relationship should also include learning from these best practices, what has worked, what hasn't worked, and of course, a diaspora community that understands a lot about transforming, about respecting people's right, being liberal, being open. I think these are some of the values that we need to pull, you know, from these. And for the past days I've been here, trust me, I've been doing my best to learn some of these core values.
Right. Cynthia, will give it to you to wrap it up here. As we wrap up this discussion, the summit will be ending in a couple of days, but this discussion should not just end with the summit. What are you hoping can be achieved that can benefit the youth of Africa?
Great. I think what I hope for specifically in terms of the youth, peace and security region, I'll reflect first on the case of Mozambique and the Southern Africa region, where we see that a lot of more and more young people are engaging in extremist activities, and also there's generally issues around a democratic recession, and people no longer believe in participating in formal spaces such as voting or dialogues and symposia around governance. Instead, we see an increase in protests and an increase in hashtagging or participating in invented spaces, which is reflective of a democratic recession. So I think my hope both for the region and the continent is a restoration of trust in democratic processes. I think that's key, not just because of the US-Africa Summit, but also resolving some of the issues we're seeing on the continent. I think that hope and belief in a democratic system will help to curb corruption. It will help to encourage more and more inclusivity, among other prospects that it holds. And then overall accountability, because in as much as we can have these robust discussions, the impetus is on us to go back into our home countries, into our respective regions, and ensure that the discussions are followed through so that they are of benefit to the African continent.
Well, Cynthia, guys, Christian, appreciate you taking time out to be with us. Thank you so much, and good luck with all the work that you guys are doing.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Ladies and gentlemen, we were joined by Christian Leke and, of course, Cynthia Chigwenya, both young members that are part of the African Union. We're talking about the US-Africa Leaders Summit. I go by the name of Mike Hove. Thank you very much for tuning in.